Eliza Hart had not always lived in the silence of the mountain woods. Years ago, she was a bustling young bride in the logging town of Clearwater Ridge, known for her laughter and her cinnamon apple pies that won ribbons at the county fair. But all of that felt like a lifetime ago, when her husband, Thomas, died in a logging accident deep in the timberline. Something inside her shattered quietly, like a cup dropped on a dirt floor. No sound, no mess, just something forever broken. The townsfolk tried to console her, offering casseroles and Sunday prayers. But Eliza had already begun drifting away, not just from them, but from the world she once embraced. She sold the little cottage on Maple Street and moved 12 miles north into the highlands, where the trees whispered and the wind didn't carry gossip. She found a patch of land by a river bend and built a modest cabin with her own 2 hands and a hammer Thomas had once held. It wasn't fancy, just a wood-burning stove, a table, a rocking chair, and a bed tucked in a corner, but it was hers. No one came up there except the occasional deer, a black bear once in the spring, and the mailman who left her letters in a rusted box 3 miles down the slope. Life had become a rhythm, steady, predictable, and quiet. She'd wake up at dawn, boil water from the river, feed the chickens she kept in a rough coop out back, and tend to her small vegetable garden, bordered by a low stone wall she built herself. Carrots, turnips, beans, and squash, enough to feed her and maybe a visitor, though visitors were rare. She hunted in the fall, preserved meat in the winter, and sewed patches into the knees of her overalls when they gave out. She had no radio, no telephone, and no calendar, only the sun, the seasons, and the wind as her timekeepers. The river was both friend and warning. Its mood changed with the seasons. In summer, it babbled softly and shimmered like a silk ribbon. In winter, it iced over in a cruel silence. And in late autumn, like now, it became a roaring force, swollen by mountain rains and melting frost, a current that could carry off a man in seconds if he wasn't careful. Eliza had great respect for it. She knew its edges, its dangerous spots, and the log she sometimes used to cross when the water was low, but she had never tested it when it surged like this. That day had started like most others. She had just returned from gathering wood from the forest's edge, her arms full of kindling and pine cones, her boots soaked from the morning dew. There was a chill in the air, the kind that hinted snow might come early this year. As she reached the cabin steps, something caught her eye, a flicker of motion on the far bank of the river. At first, she thought it was a fawn, or maybe a fox, but as she squinted, she realized it was a child, a small figure hunched over, trying to climb the slick rocks of the riverbank. That's when her heart skipped a beat. The child appeared to be alone, wet and limping, struggling with each step. It was clear something was wrong. No child should be out here, especially not so close to the river, especially not alone. Eliza dropped the bundle of wood without a second thought. Her instincts kicked in, not as a survivalist but as a woman, who had once dreamed of being a mother before fate had other plans. She wiped her hands on her apron, grabbed a rope she kept by the shed for emergencies, and headed straight for the river's edge. As she approached, she could see more clearly. The child, a young native girl, barefoot, thin as a reed, her dark hair plastered to her face, was trying to balance herself, but her left foot dragged awkwardly behind her. Each step looked like agony. Her clothes were torn, her knees scraped. Eliza called out, gently at first, "Hey there, sweetheart, are you all right?" But the girl didn't respond. She just stared, frozen in place like a doe caught between flight and collapse. Eliza's heart pounded. Something had happened, something serious. But who was this girl? Where had she come from? And how had she ended up alone on the wrong side of a raging river? She didn't know it then, but crossing that river to help the limping child would change the course of her life forever. Eliza didn't hesitate. Years of living in the wild had taught her how quickly danger could turn fatal out here, especially for someone so small and clearly injured. The river was no place for a limping child. Without a moment's delay, she tied one end of the rope around a sturdy pine near the riverbank and looped the other around her waist. The current was stronger than it looked, frothing with white water as it rolled over mossy stones and jagged roots. Eliza stepped into the icy torrent, gritting her teeth against the cold that stabbed through her boots like knives. The girl still hadn't moved. She stood like a ghost on the far side of the river, her feet barely clinging to a patch of slick rock, her eyes wide and dark, locked on Eliza with a strange mixture of fear and exhaustion. She looked ready to collapse, knees, trembling arms, hanging loosely at her sides, as if even breathing had become an effort. The child's hair clung to her face in wet ropes, and there was a raw, angry gash on her shin that leaked blood down her ankle and into the water. Eliza's voice softened as she pushed forward through the waist-deep water. "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm coming to help, okay?" She spoke calmly, steadily, trying to offer comfort while her own heartbeat thundered in her chest. The river tugged at her legs like an impatient animal. One wrong step, one slip, and she'd be swept away. But she kept her eyes on the girl, reading her body language like a wild creature. "Don't rush. Don't shout, don't make sudden moves. the crossing took longer than expected. The rocks were slick, hidden beneath swirling water and dead leaves. She braced herself with every step, gripping the rope for balance. A sharp stone jabbed into her ankle, but she pushed on. When she finally reached the far side, the girl staggered backward, clearly torn between fear and relief. Eliza crouched down slowly, keeping her hands where the girl could see them. "You're hurt," she said gently. "Let me carry you. I'll take you somewhere warm. I have food. You need rest." The girl didn't answer, not with words, but her knees gave out and she collapsed onto the rock. Eliza rushed forward and caught her before she could hit the ground. Lifting her was like lifting a bundle of wet rags. The child was so light, far too light for her age, and trembling with cold. Her dress, more like a long shirt than proper clothing, clung to her body, soaked through. Her skin was clammy, her arms dotted with scratches and bruises. Eliza wrapped her shawl around the child as best she could and whispered soothing words while stepping carefully back into the river, one arm gripping the rope, the other cradling the child tightly against her chest. The return crossing was harder. The added weight of the girl and the fact that Elisa could no longer use both arms made it slower and more dangerous. Twice, the current nearly pulled them sideways, but Eliza dug in her heels and shifted her weight, using her hips to pivot against the water. Her fingers went numb, her boots filled with freezing river water, but somehow, inch by inch, she reached the safety of the bank. She fell to her knees just beyond the water's edge, gasping for breath. The girl didn't stir. For a terrifying moment, Eliza thought the child had passed out completely, but then she felt a faint tremble, the smallest movement of the girl's chest. Still alive, still holding on, Eliza stood again and carried her toward the cabin, legs aching, arms burning, but with a strange fire rising in her chest, the fire of duty, of something greater than fear or pain. Whoever this girl was, wherever she came from, she was now Eliza's responsibility. As she pushed open the cabin door with her shoulder and stepped inside. Warmth from the stove met her like a blanket. She laid the girl down on a patchwork quilt by the hearth, fetched a dry towel, and began patting her down. Then she got the kettle going for broth, dug out her best bandages, and prepared to treat the wound. The girl's eyes fluttered open for a moment, barely able to focus. She didn't speak, but when Eliza placed a gentle hand on her forehead, the child closed her eyes again, not in fear this time, but trust. That simple, silent moment would stay with Eliza for the rest of her life. Eliza worked with quiet urgency, drawing on every bit of practical knowledge she had gathered during her years in the mountains. She had no formal medical training, just the instincts of someone who had patched up her own wounds and stitched up more than one wild creature that had wandered too close. But when she saw the deep gash running along the girl's shin, jagged and inflamed, she knew this was no scrape that would heal on its own. She boiled water over the stove, dropping in dried yarrow leaves and goldenrod herbs she had foraged months ago and kept in labeled jars on a high shelf. As the kettle hissed and spat steam, she unwrapped the torn fabric clinging to the girl's leg. Blood had soaked into the girl's thin clothing, staining it dark and stiff, and the wound had begun to crust along the edges with dirt and dried leaves. Eliza murmured gently as she cleaned it, brushing away bits of mud with a damp cloth before pouring the herbal water carefully over the injury. The child winced, a small cry escaping her lips. Eliza paused immediately. "I know it hurts, sweetheart. Just a little more. I promise. I'm almost done," she said, her voice soft and steady. The girl didn't pull away, though her fingers clenched the edge of the quilt tightly. Eliza admired her strength for someone so young and so clearly exhausted. She wasn't trying to run or resist. She simply endured, jaw clenched, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. When the wound was clean, Eliza applied a poultice of crushed plantain leaves and honey, then wrapped it tightly in fresh linen. She used a few strips of clean cloth to secure the bandage in place, knotting it with practiced fingers. Then she sat back on her heels and exhaled. The hardest part was done for now. Turning to the small pot on the stove, she ladled out a bowl of hot broth made from last night's rabbit stew. She brought it over and knelt beside the girl again. "Here, let's try to get some food in you," she said. She scooped a bit with a wooden spoon and brought it to the girl's lips. The child hesitated, then opened her mouth slightly. She took the broth slowly, sip by sip, her body responding instinctively to the warmth and nourishment. Within minutes, she finished the whole bowl. Afterward, Eliza laid a hand on the girl's forehead. She was still cold but not feverish. That was a good sign. "You're safe now," Eliza whispered. "You're going to be all right." The girl's eyes drifted shut again, not from fear or exhaustion this time, but a sense of fragile comfort. Like a wounded animal that had finally found a quiet place to rest. Eliza watched her for a while, noting every rise and fall of her chest. Her mind spun with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up alone in the forest, injured, and trying to cross a deadly river? Where were her parents? And perhaps most pressing, was anyone looking for her? Would they come here? Eliza wasn't afraid. Not exactly. But she was alert. She'd lived in this wilderness long enough to know that every story had a cause and a consequence, and sometimes, when you helped someone in need, you stepped into the middle of something bigger than you could imagine. She glanced at her rifle, leaning against the wall, then at the girl again, and pushed the thought away. She busied herself with small tasks while the girl slept, refolding the laundry by the hearth, pouring herself a cup of tea, adding another log to the fire. Every so often, she would look back at the girl and feel that strange tug in her chest, a mixture of protectiveness and ache. She had once imagined having a daughter. She and Thomas had talked about it often, sitting on the porch, swing in summer evenings, speaking the names they liked in soft, hopeful tones. But fate had carved a different path, and now, here was this child, silent, hurt, unknown, lying on her quilt as if sent by the forest itself. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the pine branches like soft whispers. Dusk was falling. Elisa moved to the window and stared out into the fading light. Snow would come soon. She could feel it in her bones. Behind her, the girl stirred slightly, curling into the quilt with a tiny sigh. Eliza turned from the window, walked back to her chair beside the fire, and sat down. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, she would watch over the girl like she was her own. Night settled over the mountains like a soft shroud, the sky turning to velvet as the last light slipped behind the pines. Inside the cabin, the fire cast a warm orange glow across the log walls, flickering shadows dancing gently on the floor. Eliza moved quietly, not wanting to disturb the girl, who still slept curled beneath the thick quilt by the hearth. Her breathing had settled into a steady rhythm, but her small frame shivered now and then, and every so often, her face tensed as if caught in the grip of an unpleasant dream. Eliza laid another wool blanket over her and crouched beside her, brushing a strand of damp hair from the girl's cheek. Her skin, though still cold, no longer felt icy. Her cheeks carried a hint of color now. Whatever fever might have tried to take hold had been kept at bay. For now, Eliza thanked the Lord under her breath. Not out of habit, but genuine gratitude, not just for the child's survival, but for the sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. After preparing a bit of food for herself, stale cornbread dipped in leftover broth, Eliza poured a cup of warm tea and settled into her rocking chair. The quiet inside the cabin was deep and soothing, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or the creak of the old wooden floorboards. She looked at the girl, then down into her tea, her thoughts running in quiet circles. It wasn't unusual to hear stories of families from native tribes passing through the mountains. She'd even exchanged respectful nods at a distance now and then while foraging or fishing, but never had she seen a child alone. That was what troubled her most. No parent, no guardian, no tracks near the river. Just this girl, limping and frightened, as if she'd appeared from the forest itself like a lost spirit. And still, she hadn't spoken a single word. Eliza had tried earlier, gently and patiently. She'd asked her name, where she was from, how she'd come to be by the river. But the girl only stared at her with those wide, dark eyes, saying nothing. It wasn't just fear, there was something deeper there, a silence that came not from shyness, but from experience. As if the girl had already seen too much. Maybe she doesn't speak English, Eliza muttered to herself, though something told her that wasn't entirely it. The girl had understood her tone, her gestures, the kindness in her voice. She had let herself be carried, fed, bandaged, and tucked in. That kind of trust didn't come from confusion. It came from instinct. She may not have spoken, but she had listened. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, and a dusting of snow began to fall. The first of the season. Eliza rose and checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight against the cold, then added more wood to the fire. She didn't want the room to lose its warmth overnight. She glanced again at the child and couldn't help but feel a tightening in her chest. How close had she come to not seeing her at all? What would have happened if she hadn't looked across the river at that exact moment? The thought made her stomach twist. She sat back down, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and allowed her thoughts to drift. The silence of the mountains, once her solace, now felt more watchful, as if the trees and shadows were holding their breath, waiting for something, or someone. Was this child part of something larger? Had something happened to her family, or was someone looking for her now? That question lingered in Eliza's mind, as the fire burned low and sleep crept into her bones. But she refused to let herself rest completely. Instead, she remained half awake in her chair, listening to the soft breathing of the girl and the shifting of wind against the walls. She kept her rifle within reach, not out of fear, but out of precaution. She had lived too long in these woods to think that unexpected wouldn't come knocking, especially after a day like today. Around midnight, the girl stirred. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused, then landed on Eliza sitting nearby. Their eyes met only for a second, and the girl's expression softened. She reached out one small hand, her fingers trembling. Eliza leaned forward without a word and took her hand gently. The girl's grip was weak, but it was real, a silent connection, stronger than any words. A moment later, she drifted back into sleep, and Eliza sat in the firelight with her hand still resting in the child's watching over her as the snow fell quietly through the night. The first light of morning crept into the valley, pale and golden, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Eliza hadn't slept. Not fully. She'd drifted in and out, her eyes flicking open with every creak of the timbers or gust of wind against the cabin walls. All through the night, she had kept her seat beside the girl, the fire slowly burning down to glowing coals. The child had stirred a few more times, but hadn't spoken. Still, her fever had not returned, and her breathing remained steady. That alone was enough for Eliza to count the night a blessing. She stepped outside just after dawn, wrapped in her thick wool coat, breath misting in the cold air. The forest was still, cloaked in snow. Everything was hushed, that peculiar kind of quiet only winter can bring, when even the birds seemed to wait before singing. She walked to the woodpile, thinking only about the fire, the child, and the long day ahead. But before she could take more than a few steps, she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. Something was off. There were prints in the snow, fresh ones, not animal tracks, hooves. She followed them slowly, carefully, scanning the edge of the trees. And then, beyond the low ridge to the east, she saw movement. A shadow, then another, then a line of dark shapes emerging, like ghosts from the mist. Horses. 1, 2, then 10, 20. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to pound. They kept coming, silent, composed, deliberate horses trotting slowly through the snow. Their riders sitting tall and proud, men warriors, dressed in leathers and furs, their long braids draped over their shoulders, spears in hand, bows slung across their backs. Their faces were stoic, unreadable, as they rode in a column down toward her cabin. She counted as they came into clearer view. 20, 50, more. By the time the last rider crested the ridge, there were nearly 200 of them, lined up in solemn silence across the clearing. No war cries, no sudden rushes, no aggression, just stillness, and a quiet that felt heavier than any words. Eliza stood frozen by the woodpile, the cold forgotten, her eyes locked on the figures before her. She felt the air thicken with meaning, the kind of moment that didn't belong to ordinary life. This was something ancient, something sacred. And though her hands trembled, she didn't reach for her rifle. She didn't move at all. From the front of the formation, one of the riders dismounted. He walked forward with calm, powerful strides, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick buffalo robe. His face was painted with ochre and ash, and a long feather trailed behind his ear. He looked straight at Eliza, not with hostility, but with deep, quiet intensity. He stopped a few paces from her, then raised his hand, palm open, fingers spread. Peace. Eliza nodded slowly. She's inside, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She's safe. The man didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, he looked past her toward the cabin and closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something deeper than sound. Then he spoke, his voice low and resonant. She is the daughter of our chief. Eliza's breath caught. She ran from an ambush. We searched all night. We feared the river had taken her. The man's eyes flicked toward hers again. But she was brought back to us. Because you crossed the river. Behind him, 2 more riders dismounted and began approaching slowly. Respectfully, as if approaching sacred ground. Eliza stepped aside. She's resting, she said, swallowing the lump in her throat. She's hurt, but the bleeding has stopped. She took some broth. Slept well, I think, didn't speak much. The warrior nodded. She saw death and fire. Words will return when her spirit is ready. He looked back at his people, then at Eliza again. You took her in when others might have left her. We saw the tracks at the river. You carried her through the water. Eliza nodded once, didn't think twice, just couldn't leave her there. The warrior stepped forward one more pace and pressed his right hand gently to his chest, a gesture of deep respect. Today, you are not alone, he said. You are now known to our people. And with that, the silence broke, not with noise, but with presence. The warriors dismounted in orderly rows, some forming a protective circle around the cabin, others kneeling and bowing their heads. No one spoke above a whisper. But in the hush of morning light, Eliza felt something she hadn't in a very long time: belonging. Eliza stood at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by a silent circle of warriors, still trying to make sense of the surreal morning unfolding before her. Snow fell in delicate, drifting flakes, coating the shoulders of men who did not flinch or speak, only waited with solemn dignity. Their stillness held a gravity she'd never felt before, not fear, but reverence. Something unspoken passed between them, like the breath of the land itself had stilled to witness this moment. The warrior who had spoken to her, clearly a leader among them, perhaps the girl's uncle or elder brother, remained close by. His eyes scanned the windows of the cabin now, his posture relaxed but alert. Eliza followed his gaze. The child was still inside, resting near the fire, unaware of the crowd that had gathered outside to honor her return. I didn't do it for reward, Eliza said softly, her voice nearly carried away by the wind. I just, couldn't walk past her. The man turned his gaze back to her. That is why it matters. Another figure approached, a woman this time, older, wrapped in a richly embroidered shawl with silver hair braided neatly down her back. Her face was marked with lines that spoke of both sorrow and wisdom, and when she reached Eliza, she extended both hands not to shake, but to offer something. It was a small pouch made of deerskin, intricately beaded, the edges lined with white feathers. Eliza hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. "It is not payment," the elder woman said in clear but accented English. "It is remembrance, a symbol." Eliza reached out and accepted the pouch gently, fingers brushing against the soft leather. She held it in her palms like something fragile. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Then the woman stepped past her, toward the cabin. Eliza didn't stop her. Somehow she knew she didn't need to. The child would know these people, would feel the connection, the safety of her own blood. She watched as the woman disappeared inside, and within a few heartbeats, she heard the muffled sound of the girl's voice, quiet, tentative, and then stronger. It was the first sound the girl had made since Eliza had found her. Tears welled unexpectedly in Eliza's eyes. She turned away, walking a few slow steps toward the edge of the pines. The mountains stretched before her, blanketed in white. She had lived alone in this wilderness for so long she had almost forgotten what it meant to be seen, not just noticed, but truly seen. Her days were spent with soil and firewood, not people, her evenings filled with silence, not conversation. And yet here she stood, no longer a shadow tucked away in a cabin, but a part of something bigger, if only for a moment. The warrior joined her again. "You carry loss," he said gently, not as a question, but a knowing. She nodded, slow and quiet. "My husband, years ago." He was silent for a time. "We lose many. The wind takes their names. But when we help another's child, the wind returns something." Eliza looked at him, surprised by the poetry in his words. He gestured toward the cabin, where the girl now sat up beside the fire, her face pressed to the elder woman's shoulder. "She will carry your name," he said. "Among our people, that is a bond." "I don't know your customs," Eliza admitted. "I don't want to disrespect you already honored them," he interrupted. When no one was watching, that truth sank deep. She looked at the pouch in her hand again, felt its weight, not just physical, but symbolic. It wasn't just a token, it was a thread, tying her story to theirs, forever. More warriors had begun to move now, tending to their horses, speaking softly among themselves. There was no rush to leave, no command given. This was not a rescue, it was a return, a ceremony, a moment that would be remembered, retold. Before long, a young boy approached, carrying a bundle of blankets and smoked meat. He placed it on Eliza's porch without a word, then bowed his head and stepped away. Others followed. Someone left a carved wooden figure, another a small pouch of crushed herbs. These were gifts, offerings, not out of obligation, but gratitude. By the time the sun had fully risen, the girl was ready to leave. Two women helped her onto a horse draped with furs, her small frame wrapped tightly against the cold. Before they rode out, she looked back, and for the first time, her eyes met Eliza's with clarity. She raised her hand in farewell, and then, the riders turned, slowly retreating into the woods. Hooves patted softly on the snow. Within minutes, they disappeared into the trees like spirits dissolving into mist. Eliza stood on her porch long after they were gone, the pouch still clutched in her hand. Something had shifted, and the valley would never forget. The valley was quiet again. Too quiet. Eliza stood on her porch long after the last rider had disappeared into the timberline, their hoofprints already beginning to vanish beneath the falling snow. The stillness returned slowly, like breath after a long cry, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not empty, not lonesome. It was full, alive with meaning. The forest hadn't simply swallowed the warriors, it had witnessed them, and something sacred had passed between land and sky. In their presence, Eliza could feel it in her bones. She finally stepped inside, letting the door close gently behind her. The cabin was warm and quiet, the fire now just glowing coals. The girl's blanket still lay folded near the hearth. Her small footprints remained by the chair where she had rested. Nothing else had been taken or disturbed. But the air felt changed, not just because of the bodies that had filled the space, but because something else had been here. Something, greater reverence, maybe, or grace. Eliza walked over to the chair and sat slowly, her knees stiff and hands still trembling slightly from the weight of everything. She held the small beaded pouch in her lap and ran her fingers across the delicate stitching. Every bead seemed to tell a story. The white feathers curled gently along the sides, soft as breath. She didn't know the language of the symbols, but she could feel the intent. It wasn't just beautiful, it was ceremonial, it was personal. She didn't realize she was crying until a warm tear slid down her cheek and landed on the back of her hand. She thought about the girl's small hand. In hers the night before, trembling, hesitant, but trusting. She remembered the way her eyes had met Elisa's one last time before riding away. There had been something in that gaze. Something knowing, something shared. It had been so long since Eliza had been seen like that, not pitied, not avoided, not ignored, but acknowledged. Not for what she had lost, but for what she had done. For who she still was. She rose slowly and crossed the room to her husband's old chest. It sat at the foot of the bed, carved by his own hands long ago, its lid worn smooth by time. She knelt and opened it gently, releasing the faint scent of cedar and tobacco. Inside were the few keepsakes she had allowed herself to keep: his old coat, his journal, the carved knife he used to take hunting. She placed the pouch among them, carefully, with the kind of reverence given to holy things. Then she sat back, took a long breath, and let it out slowly. She hadn't expected anything from that moment on the riverbank. She hadn't wanted recognition or reward. If anything, she'd assumed the act would pass unnoticed, like so many quiet choices in the wild. But this time, the wind had carried word of her kindness. It had reached people she'd never expected to meet, and in return, they had brought her something she hadn't known she needed: a reminder that the world still watched, that even in solitude, compassion echoes. Later that morning, she gathered her coat and stepped outside again, this time with a different stride. The world looked the same: the trees, the snow, the cabin nestled between two ridges, but her place in it had changed. She wasn't just a widow hidden in the woods anymore. She was the woman who had crossed the river, the one who had carried the chief's daughter on her back, the one who had chosen, without knowing why, to act. She walked to the edge of the trees and found the faint traces of hoofprints still lingering in the snow. Not many would last the day, but she memorized them, each curve and indent, each direction. They pointed proof that what she had seen was real, proof that the people had come from somewhere deeper in the forest. A hawk cried out, its wings cutting across the cold blue sky. Eliza tilted her head to follow its flight. She watched until it disappeared behind the pines, her breath rising in quiet puffs. She had been alone for a long time, by choice, by grief. But now something had shifted in her heart. The ache hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled her. In its place grew something quieter, gentler, a sense that she was still part of the world's story. And perhaps, she thought, as she turned back toward her home, that story wasn't finished yet. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the way they had been before. Eliza returned to her routine, tending the fire, hauling water from the creek, chopping wood in the still mornings. But everything now carried a new kind of weight, not burden, but meaning. Every sound in the forest, every gust of wind against the roof, every bird call in the trees reminded her that she was no longer invisible, that something had shifted in the invisible weave between her and the world. Pouch remained on the mantel now, above the hearth. She kept it where she could see it, where its delicate feathers would catch the light when the sun came through the window in the afternoon. Sometimes she would sit and study the beads, wondering about the hands that had sewn them, who they belonged to, what they had seen, what stories they carried. And sometimes, when the nights were long and the fire burned low, she would hold it gently in her lap and whisper, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to the spirits she now believed had guided that child to her door. Word of what had happened traveled farther than she expected. A few weeks later, an old trapper passing through the valley stopped at her cabin for warmth and stew. As they sat by the fire, he told her he'd heard talk of a white woman who had saved the chief's daughter, how she'd carried the girl through icy river water, how warriors had come by the hundreds to honor her, how she hadn't asked for anything in return. Elisa listened quietly, stirring the pot, saying little. "You ever hear of a story like that?" the trapper asked, not suspecting. She smiled, "A little. Maybe I have." He left the next morning, tipping his hat with a look of respect he didn't put into words, but it lingered in his eyes. And Eliza knew that even if the tale grew wild, in the telling, as such stories always do, the core truth would endure. Somewhere, in the minds of those who heard it, her name would be remembered. Not just as a widow in the woods, but as the woman who acted when no one else would. Spring came early that year. The snow melted quicker than usual, and the rivers swelled with runoff. With the thaw came wildflowers, their colors bursting across the hillsides in ways Eliza hadn't seen in years. And with them, one morning in early April, came a rider. She spotted him at first light, his silhouette just a dark blot on the trail, heading down from the north ridge. He wore no war paint, no armor, just a cloak of fur and a satchel across his chest. As he neared, she recognized him, not the warrior who had spoken to her that day, but someone younger, a messenger. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch and bowed slightly before dismounting. From his satchel, he pulled a folded piece of hide wrapped with cord. "A letter," he said in simple English. From the chief. Elisa's hands trembled slightly as she untied it. Inside was a message written in careful English. The letters slanted and neat. It spoke of gratitude, of how the girl Ayani had healed well and spoken often of the river woman, of how the story had become legend among their people, told now beside fires in the high camps. It also invited her, should she ever wish to visit the village in the East Hills, a place where she would be welcomed as kin. No pressure, no demand, just an open hand. Eliza folded the letter gently and placed it in a drawer beside her husband's old journal. She never said whether she would go, but sometimes, when the moon was full and the wind ran soft through the trees, she would sit on her porch with her shawl pulled tight and look eastward, toward the hills. And now and then, in that half-awake place between memory and dream, she would see Ayani's small face, fierce and brave, riding through the snow, her hand raised in farewell. Eliza never forgot her, and the valley never forgot Eliza. After she was gone, they told the tale of the woman who helped a limping girl across a frozen river, and woke to find warriors surrounding her cabin, not in vengeance, but in honor, because kindness, in a silent world, speaks louder than any war cry.